It is my pleasure to introduce our first panel today. The topic is strategies for the U.S. to enhance exchanges and people-to-people ties. It's a critical one for these panelists and for American councils. We have invited our moderator and panelists who bring a wealth of experience in diplomacy, public policy, project implementation, and international education to our discussion. Moderator is former Ambassador Marie Yovanovich, a career diplomat with over 30 years of service, including as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan. She has deep experience with U.S. foreign policy and public diplomacy. And we are pleased to say that we will be able to make a limited number of her books available during the break after this panel. And if you're among the first, you might get a signed copy. So look out for that. Our next panelist is Rafik Mansour, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. Rafik has a long, distinguished career in diplomacy and oversees the policies that shape U.S. educational and cultural programs around the world. Previously, he has served as the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, Chief of Mission in Singapore, leading an embassy which strategically strengthened bilateral regional ties in Singapore and Southeast Asia. He also served as Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires ad interim at the U.S. Embassy in Yerevan, Armenia, Senior Deputy Director of Public Diplomacy at the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, and as a Public Affairs Officer in several countries. Our next speaker, Dr. Katherine Brown, is the President and CEO of Global Ties US, where she works to empower individuals, communities, and nations to build trust and advance peace and prosperity through international exchange, most notably the International Visitors Leadership Program. She has a rich background in foreign affairs and public diplomacy, having served in the White House and State Department. Next is Joe Kapp, President of the National Center for Research Development, who has expertise in nonprofit leadership and capacity building. His work focuses on advancing community-based development initiatives and resources for nonprofits worldwide. An entrepreneur, author, philanthropist, educator, and explorer, he was recently appointed chairman of the board of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. Joe has worked closely with us on professional development programs, coaching program participants, alumni, businesses, entrepreneurs, and communities. And finally, we have Mr. Joe Wierichs, a senior Foreign Service officer and public diplomacy fellow at George Washington University's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. Joe has a long history with the Department of State and now brings his insights to the academic world. In his more than 25 years as a Foreign Service officer, Joe has served in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, as well as diplomatic assignments in, prepare yourselves, China, India, Belgium, Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, Israel, and at U.S. Central Command. He's also an Air Force veteran where he served as a cryptological linguist. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
It is such a pleasure for me to be here again with American Councils, especially for the 50th anniversary conference. And so I want to welcome all of you and also our very, very distinguished panelists. So what we're going to do is I'll ask each of the panelists to say a few words up front, and it may just be a few words, it may be a little bit longer, it depends on them. And then we're going to have hopefully a casual and very interactive conversation among the folks on the stage, spurred on by many of the questions that you all have previously submitted. So that's kind of the run and play for the next hour and 15 minutes. And I just wanted to say, though, that I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator to just say a few words up front, but it's only going to be a few words up front. The first thing I want to say is I am a huge fan of everything that everybody in this room does. I think that exchanges, people-to-people ties are the foundation of everything we do in diplomacy and frankly in all of the government's work. Soft power in general, I think, is one of our superpowers. Sometimes it's paid for and organized by the US government. Sometimes it just happens organically, like Taylor Swift, right? I mean, she is our secret weapon. And so I think that soft power of attraction is so much more useful and so much more effective than the hard power of military coercion. And I don't think I know a general or an admiral in the US military that doesn't agree with that last statement. And I wanted to also just give a shout out to American Councils. I'm a huge fan of American Councils. I was not personally an alumna like many of the people in this room, but spent a very formative year of my life right after I graduated from college in Moscow and spent some time with people who were there under American Council's rubric. And I can tell you that exchange that year in Moscow, it changed the trajectory of my career and it changed my life. And I can see some people nodding. I mean, anybody who has spent that formative time overseas like that, you come back, really a changed person. And I think wherever you go, changed for the better, and I think that's hugely important. But I want to tell you something else. So even beyond that very first exposure to American Councils, my father, who was a teacher of Russian and French, was a member of American Councils of Teachers of Russian, which was the genesis of American Councils, and I gather still exists as a part of this organization. And I just remember, being a kid and getting the mail, and those packets and the envelopes would come. And I grew up in a town of 2,000 people. I mean, there wasn't a lot going on in that town, and those letters kind of signified to me that there was a whole big world out there that was, going to be calling to me. And sure enough, it did later on in life. So, as you heard, I spent 33 years in the State Department, and I think that the programming that all of you and American Councils does is hugely, hugely important. I saw it firsthand. First, as a very junior officer when I was in London, and you might ask yourself, why would we have exchanges from, London, from the UK to the United States? I mean, our oldest ally, our best ally in many ways, and they speak English, and surely there's nothing that they need to know about us. But I was at a reception, again, as a very junior officer, and I was thinking, why are we doing this? As a very junior officer, and the exchange was members of Parliament from all over the UK. And I just remember talking to member after member who, and they, had a pretty deluxe exchange. They went all over the United States. And, the common refrain was, I didn't realize how big the United States is, how many different points of view there are, the topography, the cultures, the subcultures, all of that. And this is, from, that ally of ours that is, we are separated from by a common language, right? I mean, you can only imagine the good it does when people come from further afield. I served in Moscow in the early 1990s when it was a brave new world, a very optimistic one. And, it was really a privilege to be able to facilitate all sorts of people, whether they were government officials or others, to go to the United States when they finally could and had an open mind. And it was really exciting, actually, I have to say. And I think, at least for a brief period of time, made a huge difference. And then, of course, as a senior officer, meeting with foreign ministers, defense ministers, prime ministers, presidents, person after person had been on exchanges to the United States. It doesn't mean that they agreed with us on stuff, even on a lot of stuff, but they had some understanding of the United States, and that is the beginning of a productive relationship, and just hugely, hugely important. So I would say that is one hugely important thing. The other thing is, in our very challenging world today, I think that understanding helps us combat disinformation in the most basic way possible. Because if you have actually met an American, whether they are in New York or Topeka, Kansas, or someplace in California, you know that some of the things that you are reading about online are probably not right. And you have a basis of reference from which to make your judgments. And I think that, as one of my former bosses calls it, in our crowded, competitive, complex world, we really need to use every tool in the diplomatic toolbox to meet our strategic purposes. We are ready to spend billions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars, cost overruns and billions more on, one single military platform, the F-35. And yet, to my mind at least, we don't get the resources we need for exchanges. And if I said this over and over again as ambassador, if I had to make a decision about, spending money on only one thing, it would be about exchanges. And I even have my favorites, even though you're not supposed to love one child more than the other. Because they are so cost effective, they transform people's lives, they transform our relationships. And it's just a really good way to go. The problem is the payoff is often intangible, even though we know it's there. I think it's hard to measure, and sometimes it takes years, right? It takes years for that high school student that went on a flex program to become a prime minister or to become, the leading journalist in a country. And Americans, if anything, are not patient. And we need to learn, I think, some of that patience because our adversaries know that patience. And I would leave you with one last thought. Even if our own leaders sometimes don't fully understand the impact of the work that all of you are doing and the value it brings to our foreign policy and our national security, our adversaries understand it. I mean, that is why countries like Russia are doing everything they can to systematically dismantle any possibility of exchanges, of any kind of soft power influence in Russia, for example, or other countries are doing the same thing. And they are trying at the same time to extend their own through programs like RTV, right? They're putting hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into RTV, and are quite successful actually at reaching Americans. So on that note, I'm going to turn to Rafik Mansour, who knows all of these issues from the inside and is at the pointy edge of the spear of, getting it all solved.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with all of you and to be candid with you. It's a big honor for me to be with all of these distinguished panelists, but also it's a dream to be on a panel that's moderated by Ambassador Yovanovich because your example serves in a very impactful way for so many of us. So thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
What's a good starting point? A good starting point is to recognize that our country is different in so many ways, one of which is that we do not have a Ministry of Culture. Mm-hmm. We don't have a Ministry of Youth. We don't have a Ministry of Sports. Yes, we have a Department of Education, but that Department of Education tends to be mostly domestically focused, not as much about external world exchanges, etc. So we're different, which makes the role that all of you play, everybody around here, everybody in the audience, everybody who's watching us virtually, but also the bureau where I work, which is the Educational and Cultural Affairs, or ECA for short, which is part of the State Department, relevant. If I had to sum up ECA in a couple of words, I would say it's the soft power arm of the US government. I did not say it's the soft power arm of the United States, because as Ambassador Yovanovich accurately pointed out, probably Taylor Swift today is the most influential version of America's soft power. I think we are blessed as a country with having numerous instruments of soft power. It doesn't hurt that probably over 80% of the internet is in English. It doesn't hurt that the future of AI is largely shaped in Silicon Valley. It doesn't hurt that most of the top 20 universities in the world are still in our country. It doesn't hurt that we have over 1 million foreign students who are studying in American universities every single year. They pump $38 billion in our economy, and they help create 350,000 jobs. So all of these are examples of lasting soft power for the United States. But let me tell you where ECA comes in. For the most part, we are funded by Congress, and we run over 100 programs all over the globe. Some programs that you're all very familiar with, such as the Fulbright Scholarship, the International Visitors Leadership Program, and some programs that are still fairly new to me after 2 years in that bureau. Again, over 100 programs of soft power. The United States is a big country. The United States is an influential country. The United States is not loved by all, far from it, but we are an example for many. And I would argue that there are some things that if the United States doesn't do, nobody else will. And one of the key differences between us and between our geopolitical competitors is that while not everybody loves America or agrees with us all the time, we actually have some true friends and allies. Whereas I would argue that our main geopolitical competitors have transactions. There is a difference there. And some, if not all, the world admires us for this. We definitely cannot do it alone. And this is where our implementers come into play. It really takes a village to be able to carry out America's soft power all over the world. And we would not be able to do it without our implementers, such as American councils, happy birthday, such as Global Ties, such as the Smithsonian, and so many others. Let me tell you one thing that I did not know about ECA before I started working in this bureau, even though I've always dealt with ECA as a public diplomacy practitioner. While we're very global in reach, over 90% of our budget is spent on Americans and inside the United States. That's remarkable when you think about it. But that's thanks to our partners who are throughout the United States, International Visitors Leadership Program, youth programs, youth ambassadors, cultural diplomacy, sports diplomacy. By the way, Shaquille O'Neal is one of our sports envoys. And I'm sure that he signed up with us because we pay him a stipend of $200 a day. So I'm sure that he's after the money, right? For me, that gives me reason for optimism about our future. A lot of people talk about what's going to happen on November 5th and what's the impact. Well, many of us in this room have been through so many transitions before in our government. And one of the reasons that I am optimistic is that ECA, my bureau, tends to have as much bipartisan support from the Hill as just about any other bureau or any other agency could have. Because we have these exchanges across the United States, because our implementers are based across the United States, because our alumni, believe it or not, we're now up to 2 million alumni of US government programs. And as the ambassador mentioned, it makes a huge difference when you walk in the room and you're dealing with a government official, an NGO leader, a museum director who has been to the US. Roughly, today, 1/3 of US world leaders are alumni of US government programs. Moreover, I will just mention that 500,000 out of the 2 million are US alumni. And that's very important. I don't want to speak for too long, but I know that at some point we are going to get to opportunities and challenges based on some of the questions that are on your minds. One of the things that we need to do better as Americans is, in the words of Secretary Tony Blinken, is to make US foreign policy less foreign for the American audiences. We need to do a better job explaining the direct link and impact between the work that American diplomats do abroad and the security and economic prosperity of Americans. So I mentioned one reason for optimism, that we have bipartisan support from the Hill. Another reason for optimism is our alumni. When you think about it, it's our return on investment. So perhaps I'll stop here, and I look forward to learning from my fellow panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rafik. So Katherine, if I could turn to you. I mean, you obviously play and your organization plays the important role of implementer in making some of the policy ideas happen in real life.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador Yovanovich, and thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary and Joe. It's great to be with you. I want to also just acknowledge American Councils and say happy 50th. It's Lisa, Michael, the entire team. We work really closely also with Peter Vanderwater, who runs the IVLP program for American Councils, and it's great to have you as a partner for Global Ties US. I'm also an alum of GW, long time, I'm not going to say, it's been a while, but I graduated the Elliott School, and I need to acknowledge a couple of things about my own career. It was really GW that gave me the foundation for my career in public diplomacy, although I didn't quite know what public diplomacy was when I was a student here. And I later served at the State Department at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, and learned about these programs for the first time, and was one of the first staffers in the public affairs section there. And really saw the value of and the joy of bringing back IVLP and Fulbright to Afghanistan, and the impact that it had on this young, burgeoning civil society there. But I fast forward a little bit because I was so inspired by that tour, I decided to go back to academia and to get my PhD in communications and to kind of look into this a little bit more. And I decided to do my dissertation research in Afghanistan. And a lot of people told me, don't do that. Don't go. This was about 2009, 2010. And there was one person who did encourage me to go, my dissertation advisor, Professor Sean Ade, who helped me a lot during that time. And there was also someone who I met during that journey who was American Councils, because the American Councils office in Kabul was one of the few organizations that was really encouraging social science research to happen in Afghanistan. And it really felt like a relief meeting people that realized, as I did, how worthy this country was of deeper investigation and how much we could learn from it. So I want to commend American Councils for your reach and your impact globally, and just celebrate you here today. So thank you. And so what my experience also led me to my job at Global Ties US, which I have the privilege of leading with an extraordinary team. And what I loved about it was when I, again, worked at State Department, and I'd meet with alumni and talk about, what did you find to be the most surprising thing about your time in the United States? They would start talking about these communities like being in Boise or San Antonio or Burlington, Sacramento. And I was just like, where are they going? On this program. And I learned about the Global Ties Network and really the genius of the International Visitor Leadership Program, which is turning 85 years old next year, which is extraordinary that this program is as old as it is and consistently evergreen and relevant as it is. And the genius of the program was that it was to get these global leaders, bring them to Washington, but then get them out into US cities and communities as fast as possible and have them really have an authentic connection to really meaningfully build trust on their own terms, with American citizens in cities that are rural, mid-sized, larger, but also to develop a peer network where they can come together to solve critical challenges and stay in touch on issues. And it really humanized the United States in a way that was clearly very meaningful for these alums, which include several heads of state. I believe that Prime Minister Keir Starmer is an IVLP alum in the UK. I heard that Donald Tusk and the Prime Minister of Poland, his entire cabinet, are alums of this program. And so I really learned that if I really wanted to benefit, really make sure that more citizens in the United States are getting engaged in public diplomacy, that there's a way to do it within our communities here at home. And so we have this network, that the Global Ties Network, that was created to support IVLP, has really become an infrastructure for U.S. public diplomacy inside the United States. And we have 77 active members across the country in some of the cities I already mentioned. They program in all 50 states. They are proud State Department partners. They're sub-grantees. And we believe that our work at Global Ties is to really ensure that we're giving them the tools and the resources they need, to really shine as our country's greatest assets, our people, and to be the citizen diplomats that we need. And so I want to talk for a second about their impact, because Rafik, you started talking about that, and the fact that more than 90% of the ECA budget is spent in the United States is extraordinary. And what we have found is that there is an actual 8-to-1 return on that investment. So when that money is spent in U.S. communities, nearly 80 of them, that money generates more for our American economy, because that money is spent on programming. It's also, spent on all the things that take place with hosting visitors and having tourists in your city. So that is extraordinary. But we also wanted to take a closer look, too, at what is the impact of engaging U.S. citizens here in the United States, socioculturally in our communities. We found that by engaging with these global leaders, 80% of our resources and volunteers say that it supported their workforce development. They helped them acquire new skills that they need to succeed within their cities. More than 70% said that it inspired them to become more engaged in their communities, that inspired them to look around other ways that they could give. And about 1 in 3 said that they were able to forge a lasting connection, and more than 70% felt that it added more international connectivity for their communities. So when we're talking about public diplomacy, there's a huge domestic dimension of it that goes on, that was created 85 years ago. And it's always been there. There's this infrastructure that's there. And I need to commend the State Department, because they have really doubled down the last few years on making sure that they're increasing opportunity for engagement. Not everyone can get on an airplane and travel overseas to make these connections, but there is opportunity to do that in their communities. And even if they are willing to get on an airplane and come overseas, I believe there's been a real concerted effort to try to make these programs more inclusive and more accessible to all. And that's something that we're very committed to at Global Ties. And I want to say one last thing about working with Congress and the bipartisan nature of the work. We are proud to work with so many Republicans and so many Democrats in Congress, because our network essentially is the constituency in a lot of ways for the department. And so we're very proud of that. I think that also what we have found again and again is that they believe so much that the members that we work with, that our entire alliances, our entire way of doing statecraft, is the foundation for that is relationships. They believe in that relational worldview as well. And so that is something that we do not take for granted. And we very much hope that increasingly there is this realization that in order to have a strong defense, we need to have a strong offense. Mm-hmm. And we agree with you that international exchanges and public diplomacy are at the forefront of that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. And so I think you've got a great segue, Joe,
Yeah.
to talk
Thank you so
about
much. You're teeing it up
employment
perfectly.
Please.
So first of all, I want to go ahead and thank the American Councils. I'm probably the least diplomatic diplomat up here. In many ways, I started working with American Councils probably about 5 or 6 years ago, when they called me up and say, hey, we need somebody to go to Russia, and you're available, and it's in the middle of December, and would you go? And how long do I have to decide this? And they said, well, we need an answer by tomorrow. And so repeatedly, they've oftentimes sent me to places in the last moment. And I just want to go ahead and express my heartfelt thank you, not only to the American Councils, but also the staff and the team all across the world. It's through this opportunity that I've had the ability to go ahead and live out a dream. to work internationally. So my background at the Smithsonian, which I'll touch on in just a second, but there's a lot more before that. I have ADHD, and so as an entrepreneur, I've done a lot of different things. I've worked in a lot of different capacities and a lot of different roles. I started my first business when I was 19 years old in college, and I sold it when I went to graduate school at University of Pennsylvania when I was 21. And I got super interested and very excited about entrepreneurship and the role that it can play over the course of the years. And after graduate school, I worked in Silicon Valley for a little while and had the opportunity to work with very large companies, GE, Johnson & Johnson, in a lot of different roles and capacities. And so I got into a very bad automobile accident and quit my job and decided that I needed to have ownership and dominion over my time. And I started my first business, again, my second business, which I grew, which was a financial services business. And in that role, I had the opportunity to see what it meant fundamentally to create wealth and opportunity, not just for myself, but for other people. And how did other people do that? And that gave me a springboard for really understanding the role that we can play in people-to-people exchanges. And so in many regards, the opportunities that I work on are about how do we, as American councils, as the State Department, create substantive opportunities for all people in all places. And how do you do it at a very fundamental level? And so after I sold that business, I retired out to West Virginia. And I think I was 35. And so I had the opportunity to work. Yeah, my husband wasn't very happy about that. He's like, you got to get back to work. So I had the opportunity to meet the president of the community college. It was the smallest community college, about 500 people there, students. And he said, well, what do you, I met the president, I was coming out of a yoga class. He said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I don't do anything. He's like, you're too young to not do anything. He's like, what do you want to do? I said, I'd really like to teach. I'd really like to teach entrepreneurship. And so he said, well, why don't you go ahead and meet me in the office if you have any ideas. And so as a true entrepreneur, I put together an entire report for him that following evening, and we were in the office. And he said, well, this is great, but we can't afford you. And I said to him, well, that's okay. You probably couldn't pay me enough anyway, so I'm going to work for free. And it was in that role that I had the opportunity to go ahead and really understand the role of entrepreneurship in rural communities. I spent the time across Appalachia working in coal-affected communities and understanding how entrepreneurship works, not just at a tech level, because I saw that, but how does it work for a baker or for a plumber or for a farmer? I had a lot of opportunity to work with farmers and growers and really understand the role that they play. And that gave me really a broad understanding on rural entrepreneurship and workforce development. And that ended up segueing into, after the president retired, I began to think about what I wanted to do. And that's when I started a nonprofit called the National Center for Resource Development. And the nonprofit focuses on really education and capacity building in a number of different ways. It was there that I also met my business partner, Tina Metzer, she grew up in West Virginia, and I also learned and understood from my experience in working with her how important relationships are. Mm-hmm. Because we would walk into places, and she would say, oh, you know my daddy, you know my father, because he was a farmer and he was a grower. And I'm a guy from Miami Beach. I grew up in Miami Beach, so I didn't know anything. I learned a lot about feed conversion for cattle and the difference between hay and straw. I didn't know there was a difference between that. And so it was in that capacity that we started working actually with American councils. And the opportunity to be able to put together some programs. And so I began working, I got a call in the middle of COVID, and they said, hey, would you like to go to Uzbekistan? And I said, sure. And so it was in the middle of COVID that we did a program on business leaders program. And the opportunity to really understand how all of those experiences, my own personal experiences, we might be able to cultivate those and bring those together to create opportunities. And so the majority of my focus on my work in diplomacy has been at the intersection of entrepreneurship, economic development, and business. And I'm just going to make a few points, and then I'll hand it over to another Joe. So the interesting thing that I've learned about the role of entrepreneurship and economic development is that in almost every case, people want to learn more about building a business. It's almost universal. And that allows us to go ahead and have people-to-people exchanges in ways that are just so fascinating. Because what I've found is that when you go ahead and help people make money, you become friends. And you learn about their fears and their hopes and their dreams and their desires, and you tap into that. You have the opportunity to fundamentally change on a one-on-one basis somebody's life. And it really fits into the conversation about today and many of the amazing work that all of our other representatives on the panel here today are doing. But it's not just that. When we help in the success of entrepreneurs, we're planting seeds that have the capacity to go ahead and grow that work. One of the tenets of the teachings that I provide is that as an entrepreneur, the more successful you come, the more you have an obligation to give back. And that giving back is not just to the programs, but it's also to the people who are coming after you. It's part and parcel of the course that I teach. And so the role that entrepreneurs can play as ambassadors in representing their countries, values and innovations, but the opportunity to come here in the United States. We have a great program going on right now, the YTLE program, 50 entrepreneurs from 50 different countries. That tested me in a way that I never imagined, from all the way from Iceland all the way to Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I got to spend in Denver all this wonderful time with these entrepreneurs and learn from them, but also learn from each other. Now they're scattered all across the country, and later this week, or next week, they're going to come here. And we're going to spend a little bit more time about learning what they're going to learn. But I've had conversations over the last couple of weeks because we've been doing video calls. And one of the things that I've learned is how they have embraced the communities that they're in all across the country, and how the communities all across the country have embraced them. From Little Rock, Arkansas, to Hawaii, to Chicago, all over the United States. So I'm going to just end with one plug. Maybe it's an ask. I'm an entrepreneur, right? So I got to go ahead and make a pitch. I'm going to make a pitch that I think that we should look at the opportunity to go ahead and continue to expand business and entrepreneurship programs. Those programs transcend boundaries. They transcend race, communities, gender, identity, all of the various pieces, because at the end of the day, what most people want is economic security and the ability to go ahead and have a stable family life and to be able to reach a point of success, however that means to them. And when we do these programs with the American Councils, first of all, it's such an honor for me to be able to do that, and I feel so much gratitude to be able to step into that role every time I do it. But when we put on these programs, what we see is how significantly it changes the lives of individuals. I'm going to make one last piece. I'm sorry, I said that before, but I just want to go ahead. In my new role as the chair of the advisory board of the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, it's been really fascinating. I took the opportunity to go to Armenia. We have a program called My Armenia. And in that program, it's the Cultural Vitality Program. That program works with arts and artisans in various places around the world. And that program specifically looks at various arts that may be dying or dying off. And the role of that program is to go ahead and help those arts and artisans uplift and bring greater commercialization to their works. And we do that by going in there and helping them price their products, helping them understand tourism, understanding the role that they play in that vibrant economy. And what's important to that in that program for me in particular is the role that it plays in diversity and inclusion and the number of women that it uplifts because of the role that they are playing within their communities. Oftentimes, and this was said to me by one of the participants, that the women, oftentimes their arts are hidden. And this program brings it out from the house into the open air. And after numerous conversations, and it gives me chills every time, because one of the things I heard is that you've created an opportunity for me to go ahead and have agency. So again, thank you so much, and happy birthday to American Councils.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Joe. So last but not least, our other Joe.
Right, and wanting to save time for all the great questions that were submitted in advance or maybe are out there in the audience, I'll keep it short. So to pivot off of some things that the panel has already brought up, I think it's worth, in looking at all of the world leaders who are exchange alums, exemplified by our keynote speaker today, Madam President, and her experience. Yes, that is a statistic and a talking point and a reality that matters a great deal, that we have alumni who are in high places in leadership all over the world. But if we're talking about 2 million alumni, it's a minuscule percentage. It's the 99.9% of our alumni who are the more important. It's those alums who work in every other field. Because it gets to the competitive advantage that the United States has when it engages in exchange. We don't engage in exchange programs from a standpoint of protocol and hauteur and making sure that everyone's fork is in the right place. We give people homestays where they get out and meet real Americans. We give them the experience of getting out and living life with an America that they never knew existed. If their only exposure was a visit to New York or having watched an American, movie or TV show. And so the connection that we make more broadly is where our exchanges matter a great deal. I mean, you were just speaking about the work that we do in reaching out to that creative economy space or entrepreneurship. This is vitally important. And the reason why is, I guess it's already been a decade or more since Moises Naim came out with this book, End of Power, but there was a line in there that stayed with me, that in the 21st century, power is easier to get, harder to use, and easier to lose. And so we're seeing polarization, the rise of populist movements, all these things that mean that if we are only functioning in a government-to-government array as we undertake diplomacy, we will fail. But the more connections we can build in a people-to-people way, playing to that strength that we already have and this tremendous alumni network we've got, then the United States is poised for more success. I guess one last point, so we have some time for questions, and it's to end on a note of thanks. Thank you to American councils, to your leadership, to your staff all around the world, very importantly to your volunteers, the people who do it because they care, and most importantly to the alums who are here with us, who are dialed in. I've been in the business of public diplomacy for 25 years. My first tour was Shanghai, China. My most recent one was in Israel. And the consistent trait across the board when I'm talking to exchange participants coming to or going from these places I've served, the trait is bravery. It takes real guts to undertake an exchange program. And so to those who are alums in this room, I appreciate that. I thank you for the bravery you showed by participating. And if we're going to keep this going, as we're looking ahead to strategies to sustain and then enhance our exchange programs, we just have to match that bravery, that personal bravery, with a continued commitment to taking a smart approach to risk management, and understand that public diplomacy is not a risk-free endeavor, but worth it.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot. This really gives us a lot to talk about, and I'm just going to make an announcement. We're going to take the rest of the afternoon, so too bad for those other panels. But actually, we only have half an hour, so I'm going to turn to you first, Rafik. And given what everybody has said about the important work that is being done and the important effects that are being accomplished, in this increasingly complex world, as we look forward, and I'm glad to hear that that you guys think we have the political support that we need to continue to fund fund these programs. How do you see the programs moving forward and adjusting to the changes we see all around us? And so that's a very broad question. Take it in any direction you want. And I'm going to ask each of you the same question.
Boy. When I listen to this question, immediately I'm thinking budget, I'm thinking disinformation, I'm thinking how do we do it differently from our geopolitical competitors? And when you think about it, it's all tied together. America's standing in the world is important. Let me start with an anecdote that I've always found interesting and puzzling and at the same time dignified. One of the programs we run in ECA is called the U.S. Speakers Program, where we send non-U.S. government experts to the world to address an issue that the world has asked us with some help with. It could be disinformation, it could be AI, it could be women's empowerment, it could be NGO leadership, you name it. Consistently, my office sponsors, sends out US speakers to the world who, on occasion, are critical of the US administration. As someone who was not born in the United States, I smile. Because I'm thinking to myself, in how many countries in the world can you imagine the PRC or the Kremlin? And notice I did not say the Chinese and the Russians, because we do not have a problem with the Chinese people or with the Russian people. We have an issue with the PRC and the Kremlin, and that's different. And it's important to make that distinction. Relationships between countries are made up of two components: relationships between governments and relationships between people. Most governments come and go, some more quickly than others. But I understand that most people pass away at some point. And even Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin will, one day. And it's important not to lose that generation of Russians in between. So that's the importance of exchanges. But to try to stay on question, I think it will be difficult for us to have the money that we need without the support of the private sector. So I think that public-private partnerships are important. Our model of conducting soft power all over the world is different, let's say from the French or the British, where, as you know, Alliance Française or the British Council, they charge for some of their programs. We do not. But in America, we actually believe in win-win situations. And I do believe that despite all of our imperfections, that brand USA is still a beautiful brand. Mm-hmm. And it is also, just like it is in our interest to partner with the private sector, it is in the interest of the private sector to partner with us. We're going to have to address this information. We're going to have to address AI responsibly. And you will see that many of the programs that we are doing try to address that. I will give you a concrete example, recent example. Lebanon, definitely not a very, very tragic situation in the whole region. But the United States government has been making tremendous effort at trying to get out American citizens safely, including a big expense from the US government. And we're running flights outside of Lebanon for under $300 a person. But the Russian disinformation apparatus is claiming that we are charging $8,000 for each of those tickets. So it's real. We definitely need the support of Congress. We need the public-private partnerships. We need our implementers. We need to do a better job showing to Americans living in America what's in it for them. So I go back to what I said earlier, it takes a village.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Katherine, do you want to address that question, either keying off of something Rafik said or just in general?
Yeah, I think that the U.S. public diplomacy apparatus really is the envy of the world. I think what we've created this flexible toolkit of programs and activities is extraordinarily unique. I used to run an office called the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, which was mandated by Congress to really explain the apparatus and share how things are going and how funding is being used. And I would have there be countries who would always want to talk with me about developing, how do we develop our public diplomacy apparatus in our country, allied countries. And it's really powerful what we have. And I think the most important thing about kind of where public diplomacy is going is that it's important that it stays flexible. It's important that we have a variety of tools. Not every tool is going to work for every audience and every policy issue. And it's up to our colleagues in the field, to really be able to determine, how to build a campaign that's effective for the people that you need to connect with to be able to move the ball forward on a certain policy issue. So it's really important that Congress helps maintain that flexibility. I think sometimes what happens is that, I'm very partial to the International Visitor Leadership Program, of course, and our work with U.S. Exchange alumni. But I think sometimes it happens that we approach Congress kind of by program and not by how all the programs and activities come together to really connect with different audiences around the world. And I think that, you can definitely, there can be some members of Congress who are only going to care about China or Russia. And I think the point there is that, I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but I believe it's that the Kremlin outspends our public diplomacy, which is about $1 billion, 5-to-1, and China is 10-to-1. This is extraordinary, the reach and the work that they're doing to connect with publics around the world. And we are being outspent. But we do have the most, I think, genius, flexible toolkit, and it's really critical that we continue that and that we're able to do things like STEM and entrepreneurship, that we're able to fight disinformation. But the policy changes are the policy issues are so unique around the world. We need to be able to be responsive, and we need those resources, and public-private partnerships is part of that. And I can speak more a little later to what we're doing on that front.
Yeah, I'm actually very interested in following up with you on that. Joe?
Yeah, I just want to key off sort of the private industry part of things, because it's really fascinating to me, especially as I've gotten into this more and more. One of the things that is the envy of the world is our entrepreneurial ecosystem in the United States and our capital markets. And you talk to anybody who's interested in a business, and they're going to look at the United States.
Thank you.
Entrepreneurial ecosystems really only truly thrive in democracies, because you can't go ahead and you're not necessarily willing to take a risk to start a business if you know at some point the government's going to come in and take over your business or shut you down. And if you create a technology that becomes too powerful, or your business becomes too powerful, that's threatening. So in the United States, we have the opportunity to be able to go ahead and look at how do we leverage economic development, and in particular entrepreneurship and the business leader programs that we have, because it is the envy, it's the crown jewel of the world. Who doesn't want to go ahead and be a part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and access our markets and our capital markets? So the opportunity to have that play out in diplomacy. And the other thing I'll say is that in my emerging experience in diplomatic field, it seems to me that oftentimes the first go-to when there's issues and we want to begin to have an impact is we look to what are the tools that we can use from an economic perspective? How might we go ahead and make some economic decisions as we make some diplomatic decisions as one of our first levers that we may use? So understanding how we go ahead and work with exchange fellows and that people-to-people contact and helping them help their own families, that's fundamentally to how do we go ahead and create change and opportunities both for the fellows as well as the Americans.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question? And actually, maybe Joe, you might want to, second Joe, might want to address this. I mean, I found, I spent most of my career in the former Soviet Union. Obviously, the issues of policy, politics, democracy, really challenging in that part of the world. And even if leaders and peoples said that that's what they wanted, they didn't always understand exactly what that entailed and how painful the transition could be, and that rice bowls get broken and nobody likes that. So I found that often one of the best ways to approach it was actually through economics and business leaders, that you don't want to go head-on about the importance of independence of the courts and rule of law, but everybody understands that they, when it comes to them having a problem and going to a court, they want a level playing field. They want to make sure that that judge isn't bought and paid for, that they can get the right judgment. And so I'm just wondering if through exchanges that's a part of what you do on the economic side. Well, Joe, and then we'll come to you,
I'll
Joe.
defer to you in just a second, but I've actually seen that that actually bears out. And through the American Councils, I've had the opportunity to travel around the world in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and a lot of different places, a lot of different spaces, and a lot of different countries. And the conversations that we have are conversations about how do you build your business and who are your customers and understanding your target market. So even if it's just under the context of, if you're going to come here to the United States, you have to understand that if you want to build your business, you're going to have to work with and co-create with a lot of different people from a lot of different places, spaces, beliefs. And so we're actually able to have a lot of meaningful conversations, both within our group and then amongst the other fellows, in conversations that probably would not necessarily be welcomed. And things, however, that are very particularly important as they think about coming to the United States. And I was really pleasantly surprised as we've talked about diversity and inclusion and the importance of the role of marginalized communities and entrepreneurship, to be able to have those conversations. It's a unique context in economic development and entrepreneurship.
Almost always, it seems, when you're engaging in public diplomacy, there's the top line title, and then there's the subtext, and that's what we're really after. And that's true of so much of what we do. And think about the purpose for which we engage in English language, or reaching kids with STEM, STEAM, educational opportunities. In many cases, it's because it's a venue for us to open up a conversation about topics that we could never sell as the top line subject. And it also creates opportunities for entire populations and communities that have historically been on the outside in these countries where we work. We recognize that to be a long-term danger to stability and prosperity, so we address it with something that is not on the nose about stability or economic growth, but it's about English or STEM, STEAM, or entrepreneurship. So this, I find out, happens a great deal. And it's one of our challenges, because if, after all, what we're after is not what's on the subject line, it becomes hard to justify our budget, justify our existence. If what we're selling is the subtext, we know that to be true, but what we're requesting is money for what's on the subject line, it becomes hard. Which, as someone who's just returned from 5 straight years of being a practitioner in the field, a public diplomacist, I should tell you, it's part of our budget planning exercise. We have to attach pretty much everything we do to a specific policy objective, and that's great, and as it should be. However, for me, it's always about the subtext of a phrase which we're not even supposed to use so much in our budget justifications anymore. It's mutual understanding.
Right.
It's helping the broad base of people in the country where I serve understand the U.S. better, like us more, hopefully, understand us better. That's the key. And
Can I just interrupt? Yeah. Why can't we use that phrase anymore?
Well, I mean, it's more saleable as a justification if we can attach our work, every element of it, to a policy objective. And in the long term, that's always true.
Right.
It's just that you have to go through many steps, and as you mentioned at the top, many decades to prove a policy outcome. And of course, it's impossible to prove a negative. A bad thing didn't happen because of our public diplomacy outreach. Who can say? Yeah. But it's surely not enough to just vibe it that these exchanges work. We need metrics where we can find them. But our challenge is that oftentimes these can't be connected to the policy that matters to Washington in the moment. Right. We need bravery on the part of our leadership and on the Hill for people to continue to stand up and say it's worth the long-term investment.
Yeah, especially when that's just a rounding error on, the plane of an F-35,
Yeah.
or the wing of an F-35. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not a lot. So did you want to have a final word on this particular topic, this huge topic of kind of the future of exchanges? And especially, kind of tying the policy
Yeah.
to what is actually being done.
Yeah. I definitely agree with Joe about the.
That's easy to do. There are two of them.
Yeah, right. It's half the panel.
But I think that it's also very important to be able to tie what we all do to the national security strategy of the United States, which is this document that needs to come out at least once per administration. This administration, it was released in October of 22. It's about 46 pages. I recommend you read it. But in the meantime, you're going to trust me when I try to summarize it in one sentence. Here is what the US government is trying to do in the world: outmaneuver our geopolitical competitors and address global challenges. That's the summary of the 46 pages. When you think about it, it's impossible to do that as the US government alone, because you take something like addressing global challenges that goes from food security to energy security to counterterrorism to climate change. It's impossible for any one government, not even the United States, to do it by itself. You need friends and allies. You build that over time in a meaningful way through those exchanges, through that mutual understanding, through the 100 different programs that EC is running, through all the programs that our wonderful implementing partners are supporting us with or doing on their own, through higher education, through our US universities. But I think it's important for us for a realistic approach to the future, Ambassador, for an entity that needs to justify its budget and its existence. Mm-hmm. I think the right formula is not to approach soft power as an absolute value in itself, but to approach soft power as a formidable instrument of power, one of the true sources of wealth for the United States, but it's also how you orchestrate it, how it plays well with the other instruments of power that the United States possesses in order to advance the national security strategy of the United States. And I go back to a point the ambassador made earlier, that oftentimes the staunchest supporters for the budget of the State Department is the Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. Because they know how for every dollar spent on public diplomacy, how much blood and treasure that saves them.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree with you that soft power is not a goal in and of itself, that it's a tool. And hard power is too, right? The military, I mean, we love our military and we are glad that we have the most powerful military in the world. And there's no better feeling than, negotiating, as many of you on this stage know, and having, the U.S. military behind you as you're making your points. People sit up and take notice. But hard power too is just a tool. Mm-hmm. It's not a goal in and of itself. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we forget that, I think, a little bit. So we only have 10 minutes left. And so I did want to give you the chance, I think both of you sort of mentioned private-public partnerships, but I'm going to sort of add a little twist to the question, because in my experience, it sounds like both of you are rather positive, and I've seen some really positive experiences with public-private partnerships, but I've also seen kind of negative ones of, pet projects of influential people in the United States that get the ear of somebody who's, influential in our government, whether on the legislative or executive side. And, all of us at the embassy are wondering, why are we doing this? Which, can sometimes be true of other things as well. But, just in this context. So, being a devil's advocate a little bit on that one. So go for it, Katherine.
Great. Yes. Okay. So we have, there's two angles of this that I'm coming from. Is one is that it's next year is the Expo 2025 in Osaka, and there'll be a USA pavilion, and Global Ties US supported the USA pavilion in Dubai, and that was the first time in about nearly, I think, 30 years that the State Department coordinated the USA Pavilion from within the department. Normally there was outside partners and consortiums that put it together. And we had a big push within Congress to appropriate the funds, or at least authorize already appropriated funds for it. But that really requires a lot of public-private partnership for that to work. That is a fantastic, it's incredible. It's like an American space on steroids. It's an incredible mega platform. It's a mega event. It's a mega platform. And on top of that, it's a huge opportunity for the commercial service as well, to connect with U.S. businesses that are working in the country. And then also, definitely in the past, there's been corporate sponsors and corporate support as well. So I'm thinking about it from that angle. Mm-hmm. Especially with soft power, to really be able to highlight some of the more iconic brands that are really attractive to the visitors for the expo. So I think it's really critical for that. But also, Global Ties US has had, recently we've entered into a strategic alliance with Marriott International, who knew about the International Visitor Leadership Program, was incredibly inspired by so much of the work of the Educational and Cultural Affairs Bureau. And they wanted to figure out how to support it. And they had their own Peace Through Travel program to support greater connections. People who travel are curious and want to have an authentic experience when they're traveling. So how can they deepen that? How can they maximize that? And so we worked with them to build out a dinner diplomacy program, because home hospitality is a really critical part of the International Visitor Leadership Program, but also various exchange programs. When global leaders come to the United States, we want to make sure that they're actually connecting and having meaningful conversations with U.S. citizens. But at the same time, that has always required some resources. You have volunteers who have means to host. Hosting dinner parties is expensive. And so it was almost inherently exclusive, because our community partners were going, and approaching the same people again and again to host. So how do we open up access? How do we expand and include more members of communities? We needed stipends. We needed gift cards for grocery stores. We needed to allow college students to have some money to get pizza and have a picnic in the park. And so Marriott International really seized on that idea and gave us some funding to deepen our engagement for community-based members. So that's what we're looking to do, is to work with corporations and private philanthropic charities or individuals to give us funds to deepen what ECA is already doing.
Yeah, okay. So thank you. Did you want to add anything to that?
Not every partnership goes well. Yes. You're absolutely right. I will just mention a couple that have gone particularly well for ECA of late. One is American Spaces that Katherine mentioned, which are basically like American cultural centers all over the world. We have over 700 of them in over 140 countries. And it's a space for people to come and learn more about America. If you're interested in doing business in America, if you want to study in America, there is an Education USA service. So it's a platform, it's a way for us to be present all over the world. And the Googles of the world, the Microsofts of the world have been very supportive of us also in trying to educate people about this information through the American Spaces. That's one example. Another example that's dear to my heart has to do with entrepreneurship and women's empowerment is a program called AWE, the Academy for Women Entrepreneurs. And basically, it's a program to help women entrepreneurs either start their business or scale their business. And this is a partnership that we are doing with ASU and as well as with Amazon. And it's going very well. We have graduated over 25,000 women from 100 different countries over the past 4 years alone. And one thing that will always stay with me is when I attended the first regional summit for AWE in Malaysia. there were 200 women present, and I went from table to table to ask them, what is the biggest challenge that you face as a woman entrepreneur? The answer will always stay with me, because the most common answer was, this is in 2023 it was, the most common answer was convincing my husband to let me work.
Yeah, interesting.
So that's still very real.
Yeah, I should say so. So we have about 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to ask each of you to either summarize or say whatever I didn't give you a chance to say, starting with Joe. Joe.
Thanks. I'll segue off of what Rafik was just speaking about in his example of a good public-private partnership. It's been my experience that oftentimes the common ground, the common interest as an embassy or an office at state is working with a private sector partner is around shared goals in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility space. I know I can think of an example from my time in Israel where some big US brand name tech firms found ways to expand STEM educational opportunities that provided a pathway to employment for Arab Israelis and for Palestinians living in the West Bank. To the point where in the end, after a nudge from the US Embassy, what started as a partnership became a self-sustaining effort on their part. And so that to me is important, that we can take, I think there's already intrinsic to the act of undertaking exchange, there's an inbuilt lean or bias towards an openness and vulnerability that makes it possible to undertake DEI efforts in a really sort of honest way. When you meet corporate potential partners in that space, you're already halfway there. And so I think if we're looking for a natural way for there to be sustained momentum in public-private partnerships, it's there. But it's been a real pleasure and an honor to be on this panel. So thank you all.
Yeah, I want to echo two things. One, thank you very much for inviting me here. I saw a lot of workforce development. I saw a lot of private-public partnerships play out with workforce development and education. So many businesses need skills for the future, and we look at artificial intelligence and the role that education plays in workforce development and at the community colleges, whether it was in Hazard, Kentucky, or all across Appalachia. Skilled workers and creating public-private partnerships that train workers, whether it's plumbing or it's AC or the folks who are now down in Florida and North Carolina that are putting the electricity back to work. And so I think one of the great places where we can probably do a little bit more work is looking at the role of workforce development and the skills here across the United States, but across the world, and that collaborative piece. And again, just on the entrepreneurship and the economic development side, the wonderful thing is that when we bring entrepreneurs over here, it's not a one-way road. And that entrepreneurs here and business owners here and businesses here get a new perspective. And oftentimes there's substantive deals and businesses that take place. I will tell you that I personally have started a couple of different business opportunities because of the folks that I've met through American councils and the opportunities. But I also know that the YTLE and a lot of the business leaders that come here are working and doing and creating businesses because of those exchanges. And those are real numbers. Those are real, it's real commerce and real numbers that's taking place.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes, as part of this conversation, I kept remembering there's a wonderful video that Rick Ruth, he might be in the audience, Rick Ruth put together about the history of public diplomacy and the history of the Educational and Cultural Affairs Bureau and how it came together. Highly recommend it. I think it's on YouTube. And there's also a wonderful book that Bruce Gregory recently published, American Diplomacy's Public Dimensions. And what both the video that Rick put together and the book, Bruce's brilliant book, what it reminds us is that that soft power in public diplomacy has always been part of diplomacy. It can't be seen as being a separate,
that's right.
a separate entity, but also that really the structure around it was really forged from conflict in the 20th century, right? And it's really important. It's been such a critical vehicle for building international cooperation and peace in the same way that international institutions forged from war have been. And we've been doing some remarkable work. So I want to make sure that we're, as we're talking about how this is under-resourced, we're also acknowledging the incredible role that it's played in statecraft in the last century. And I just want to thank the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication here at GW for churning out the next generation of wonderful thought leaders and contributors to this field, and definitely to American councils. Happy birthday.
It has been my experience that there are two American values that the world admires, even if they may despise our foreign policy. These two values are education and entrepreneurship. And when you think about it, this is at the core of what you do, and it's at the core of what public diplomacy does, at the core of what ECA does, at the core of what brings us all together. And that gives me hope.
Yeah. So thank you to the panel. I just want to end by saying that I've learned a lot from all of you, and I'm sure our audience members, both virtual and in person, have as well. And I think at the end of the day, what we learned, or what was reinforced, was this is a win-win. Because mutual understanding, even if it's maligned term, mutual understanding is what it's all about, where other countries and peoples understand us a little better, and we understand them a little bit better. I mean, that is the pathway to good policy and peace in the world, right? And that's what it's all about. So I want you all to join me in thanking our wonderful panel. And thank you. Thanks a lot.